Welcome to Ruins and Haunting Heritage. My name is Dr. April Bisa. I'm an associate professor of anthropology at Vassar College, and this is my archaeology seminar for the fall 2020 semester. Hello, we're back for part 2 of what's going to be many parts of our review of the book Blurring Timescapes, Subverting Erasure, Remembering Ghosts on the Margin of History. Last lecture we left off having just completed Erica Begun's Material Memories, Interpreting Souvenirs and Heirlooms in the Archaeological Record. And for this recording, we're going to focus on Chapter 3, Heather Van Wormer's Journeys Through Space and Time, Materiality, Social Memory, and Community at the City of David. We're also then going to move into some Paul Connerton's How Societies Remember, which is not an assigned reading for the course, but as a way of reinforcing that this theory of memory is a robust form of archaeological, anthropological, social theory that needs to be learned and understood. It's not that we're speaking of memory in a general sense, but that there's a theory about how societies remember, how memory is created, how it's passed on, and why certain things are deemed worthy of remembering in a communal sense instead of an individual sense. So Heather Van Wormer's article here focuses on a religious colony in Benton Harbor, Michigan. And it wound up split into two different groups, the City of David and the House of David. And the chapter starts with that the author was working there as part of writing a National Register nomination for the property, and that was an assigned reading earlier in the course, was the National Register criteria of how architectural places and archaeological places are evaluated for application to the National Register of Historic Places. So Van Wormer starts off with saying that she was quite confused in the beginning, because stories told to her of people who are long dead were confusing her because they were being spoken of as if those people were still there and still alive. And she knew that she wasn't meeting them herself, so she was confused about all of these people that seemed to be there in a spiritual sense, but not necessarily in a ghostly sense or in a corporeal, alive human sense. So one of the reasons for her confusion, she says on page 34, is that members of the colony speak of past colonists using the present tense. So something as small and linguistic as what tense you use to refer to your ancestors in can make sense to you, but not necessarily make sense to the other people around you. So she says on page 34, it took a long time for me to figure out who and how many people actually lived in the colony in a corporeal and alive sense. She says, it is as if the past member is still there, or as if the person relating the story witnessed the event. Sometimes these stories are triggered by very clear markers to individuals, such as plants or other contributions they made to the colony. Other times, these remembrances came from unmarked material objects, buildings, or landscape features, as if they are vessels for these memories and past members. So she says later on that, and there's photographic examples of this, that say a tree at Vassar College, we have lots of trees that have plaques, and they're planted by or planted in memory often of somebody. So they would say something like, oh, Anne's tree, but they would say Anne's tree as if Anne was still creating that tree, taking care of that tree, still around. So this sense of the marked versus unmarked objects. For some things, the marking, the plaque, is a way of recalling people that you never knew. But in the unmarked objects, it requires a lot more attention to the stories and memory of the stories, that you would speak of that tree as Anne's tree if it wasn't marked as Anne's tree. And that if you never met Anne, that's quite an extra step. So on page 36, she says, these past members are not seen as ghosts haunting the present. Instead, community members who die in the faith will be with surviving members again in the millennium. So this is their kind of eternal life. And remembering them in the present is a form of community maintenance. And this remembering has deep connections to material culture. So in some religions, you have to do a lot of genealogy and be able to explain exactly who you are descended from. And part of that is because when you get to whatever next level, whatever heaven that you're expecting to go to, you're going to meet these people again. And it would be rude to not know who they are, right? So in the House of David and the City of David, the religious colonists who lived there actively try to remember everybody who's ever lived there, because they are going to meet them again, and they need to know who they are in a personality sense, because they're going to spend all of eternity together. So here, these, let's call them spirits, are a way of maintaining your community for an intentional purpose of reuniting your community in the future. So they use a lot of material culture to do this, which makes it very archaeological in nature. So on page 36, she says, architecture and material culture can be intentionally designed to reinforce their mutual knowledge in overt ways. They deliberately attempt to restructure fundamental social relations, such as class, family, and gender. And these are reflected and reinforced in their carefully prescribed material world. Material culture both reflects and reinforces social ideals, and community members are keenly aware of the symbolic meanings represented in artifacts. So an interesting way to think about this that is easy for people who are not part of this religious community is the men versus women signs on public bathroom doors, and the problems we've had as a culture coming up with a symbol that represents that anybody is allowed in, right? That it doesn't have to be a gendered norm. So that is a material object, that is an artifact, the sign on a bathroom, and it reinforces just fundamental social relations by saying whether or not in this community it matters whether you are gendered or biologically male or female to be able to enter that room. So in this commune, they have their own ways of having their architecture and their artifacts reinforce their ideals across their landscape. So here she says that timescapes are created by shared memories. So on your landscape, if you're able to have the past, present, and future all at once on your landscape, you're kind of creating timescapes, especially if you could switch from one to the other or speak of all three at the same time. On page 37, she says, I argue that these rememberings, while not ghosts or hauntings, in the stereotypical ways we normally think of them, are nonetheless a form of positive haunting and a means for this community to form meaningful connections between their past, present, and future. So these aren't hauntings that anybody wants to exercise. They don't want it to end. They are actively trying to keep the spirits of the past people alive in their present. She says, speaking of intentional communities in general, that they are a form of cultural critique, that through the process of creating their social structure and community, intentional community members are directly or indirectly enumerating what they find wrong with the larger society. So thinking back to Harrison and Schofield's book, After Modernity, that one of the problems about the contemporary time period that we live in now is that we intentionally forget everything because we have this sense that the past is useless and that the future is the solution to everything. Even your sneakers, if they're 2 years old, they're not high-tech enough. Get rid of them. So an intentional community where everybody in that community actively tries to keep the past alive in the present because they believe that all of these people will be together in the future is a cultural critique on that hyper-consumption that we are in today. So the House of David, on page 40, rejected mass consumerism, increasing social anonymity, and vices like alcohol, but also opened an amusement park and had a traveling jazz band. So sometimes these intentional communities are balancing what do they care about, and also they need to make money. So this is like, say, in Pennsylvania and Ohio, the Amish, that shun a lot of what we think of as today's society, but yet they sell things at places on the roadway because they still need money, but they only need just enough money to get by. They're not trying to become rich and win at life through the acquisition of material goods. So at the City of David, they believe that only the believers' souls are immortal, but that their bodies will be as well. So thinking about what would a heaven look like in your culture, in your religion, the people that ascribe to the City of David think that you're going to have your corporeal body in the afterlife, but only people who believe will be in the afterlife, nobody else. So by keeping a living memory of everybody who's ever been in your intentional community, you basically will know everybody in the afterlife because there's nobody else there. And therefore, you are going to be one of those people that somebody else will try to remember. And therefore, you will all have friends. You won't be alone in the afterlife. You'll have everybody. So on page 41, she says, the colony and colony experience are considered to be transitionary in nature. Members have left one existence, the outside world, before they join the colony, but they have not yet arrived at their destination, which is this thing they call the millennium. For this reason, the colony and colony life are seen as a place of transition, not in the former world, but not yet in the next world. The colony at Benton Harbor was not supposed to be utopian or perfect in any way, because perfection is in the millennium, which has not yet arrived. So it's okay that they have an amusement park and jazz bands and traveling basketball teams and things like that, because they have to survive in this world. But they have to shun the things that they can shun to show that they are true believers so that they will be allowed into that next world. So this split came in the 1930s when the original House of David was established in 1903. So that's a couple of generations for each there. On page 47, she says the new colony's architecture after the split, unlike the architecture at the old colony, the City of David built efficient and functional buildings with very little in the way of embellishments. So the original House of David had all these fancy architecture with trumpets on the stairwells and things, speaking to and reminding people of the millennium. But when they split, the City of David just built efficient and functional buildings without those embellishments. And she says it's because for the City of David, the buildings were meant to be used, not to emphasize the wealth or success of the colony. These buildings emphasize the practical and transitionary nature of the colony in their design and the construction materials. So part of the split was because some people felt that some of the colonists were getting away from that this is a transitionary period and there's no need to acquire wealth to win, because you win by getting to the next stage, not by acquiring wealth. So when they split, their buildings reflect that. So getting back to National Register criteria, back to architecture, back to archaeology, back to things, when you see these things on the landscape as ruins from past cultures, you could say, oh, they're less than because they're not as fancy. But it's not that they're less than, it's that they don't care as much about consuming. So how much in our lives and in the archaeological interpretations do we think that people need to ascribe to capitalism in order to have been successful, versus thinking that a rejection of capitalism might be more successful than the acceptance of it? So we get into some social theory here. So she talks about Hallwalks, Maurice Hallwalks, and says that Hallwalks argues that one has to understand the social context in order to understand a person's or group's memory of the past. To remember, one needs others. To remember is to understand a relation. And the past is formed in consciousness through what Hallwalks termed the mnemonic agencies of social relationships, of objects, of landscapes invested with social meanings. So this social theorist, Maurice Hallwalks, says that mnemonic agencies of social relationships are objects and landscapes invested with social meanings. That is extremely archaeological, that you could look at the landscape and the things in the landscape and see social relationships, that is how communal memory is created, formed, maintained, and transferred from one individual to the next. So on page 54, the author says, at the City of David, colony members are part of a community that exists outside the boundaries of linear time. The origins, travels, and work of individual members are marked and remembered, often in the landscape of the colony itself. For example, many different flowers, shrubs, and trees are marked with signs naming the species of the plant and their associated colony member. Others are not visibly marked, but their history and significance are commonly known and often casually mentioned in conversation by colony members. This functions to keep the past alive in the present, but this practice is more than just remembering. It has deeper roots in faith. Right? So it's not just what Maurice Hallwalks was talking about. You have to understand the faith of the house in the City of David in order to understand why that they do this. So on page 55, she says, not only do the past and present converge, but the future is part of this timescape as well. Given the sacrifices necessary for colony life, such as no alcohol, memories of past colony members provide current colony members with the comfort that they too will be remembered. So in this sense, speaking of spirits is a way of ensuring your own immortality.